Hello, I'm LemonBread. Backwards compatibility is a big thing for game consoles, but frankly, why stop there? It's one of the best features a console could have, so much so that I think we could do some expansion. I mean, hey, if backwards compatibility can work on a Wii, surely it can work on a toaster. That's why I'm proud to announce LemonBread BC, allowing you to experience the best in previous LemonBread content.
Now what the changes in this,
This was a fucking mistake.
Say you have a game console. As successful or unsuccessful as it may be, there's only so long it can last before newer hardware takes its place, which means it's time to upgrade. But the process of making the switch can be difficult for some. There has to be an incentive involved, such as games. And what better way to establish your console than with a boatload of games that have already existed. Backwards compatibility, as it is called, the ability for one console to travel through fucking time. It's a big draw for people when buying game consoles. I mean, the ability for one console to play a wide range of a previous console's games is just, in general, a really cool feature, since it lets people who didn't have the previous console finally have something to play the games they missed out on, and lets previous owners have one consolidated system to play those games on. You'd think. You see, backwards compatibility has always been kind of funky. Of course, as newer technology gets more and more advanced and older technology gets more and more obsolete, trying to bridge the gap between consoles can be considerably tricky. But to understand how it got like this in the first place, we need to go back to the 1980s. Atari, formerly one of gaming's biggest juggernauts, now known as the creators of the Atari 7800. While majorly unsuccessful compared to the competition at the time, the system had a few innovations packed in, such as the ability to play games from a better console. It being backwards compatible with the 2600 is actually pretty notable though, being a console from the mid-1980s, way before the concept became commonplace in consoles. The 7800 manages this by reusing 2600 chips for the 7800 and slowing down the processor to match. All decently impressive yet simple technology for 1986. Now, you may be wondering, why isn't the 5200 included in the 7800? Well, first off, that is very astute of you, and second off, it mainly comes down to differences in cartridge size and console architecture. Yeah, this was a very different time for gaming where even cartridge size influenced your backwards compatibility. But it's not like there weren't options, just take a look at Atari. Proceeding to the 7800, the 5200 is arguably worse, if anything, but at the very least we can thank it for being the earliest backwards compatible console I could find. Even though the cartridge sizes between the 2600 and 5200 were different, an adapter was released that, well, adapts the cartridge slot to fit 2600 games. These weren't uncommon back in the day, allowing one console to play games from another console, which was usually the 2600, and I'm surprised people just didn't cave and buy an actual 2600. But nevertheless, Atari were still forerunners when it came to backwards compatibility for their consoles, way before the concept became mainstream. And look where that got them. But unlike Atari, adapters continued to live on for a bit, albeit not as prevalent as they once were. But another early example of backwards compatibility using these adapters can be found with Sega, actually. The power-based converter, aptly put, is an accessory that lets you play Master System games on a Sega Genesis, finally allowing non-Master System owners to play games such as Sonic the Hedgehog, Cool Spot, and Terminator 2. It is also here that we hit a brick wall, as no other 4th or 5th gen game console had true backwards compatibility. Like I said, it took a long time for this concept to catch on, but it's easy to see why. The 5th gen ushered in a slew of newcomers to the console market, which made the lack of back comp support pretty obvious. And even older companies like Nintendo and Atari still used proprietary cartridges for their game consoles. Even the biggest contender for back comp support, the Sega Saturn, barely even used its cartridge slot, which was already incompatible with Sega Genesis games. I mean, what else do we have? The Super Game Boy? Fuck it, let's talk about the PS2. The PlayStation 2, you might have heard of it. The best-selling console of all time, released in 2000 and quickly rose to the top compared to the other 6th gen consoles of the time. Even more milder successes like the original Xbox, paled in comparison to the PS2's might. And one of the biggest draws for consumers was the fact that it could play PS1 games, another already successful system. It was a major selling point and helped popularize the concept of backwards compatibility. Hell, it became so ubiquitous that many people point to the PS2 as being the first backwards compatible console, without truly respecting their elders. But it's easy to see why, at least, since it pulls it off really well. Most PS1 games work on the base PS2 fat model and continue to work all the way up to the final slimmer versions in 2006 and 7, once again by simply reusing a similar chipset. And it wasn't just limited to games either, as even the controllers are interchangeable with both consoles, since they both use the same ports, making it a rare example of forwards compatibility in the gaming sense. And even if this back-comp support wasn't the only thing that influenced the PS2's popularity, it sure as hell was a major factor in deciding it as the clear winner of the 6th generation. And it wouldn't take long for other companies to take notice, since even though the PS2 was the only backwards compatible 6th gen console, all of the 7th gen consoles were backwards compatible at one point or another in their lifespan, starting with the Wii. You may have heard of the PS2, but you've definitely played the Wii. See, as good as the GameCube might have been from a subjective standpoint, objectively, it was a failure. So going forward, Nintendo wasn't ready to make the same mistakes as they did with the GameCube, and they did this by completely detaching themselves from the hardcore gaming market and instead rebranding to become the console your grandparents play. And it worked. Not all was lost in this departure, however, since the Wii comes ready-made with pretty much full GameCube backwards compatibility, being able to read and use GameCube discs, memory cards, and controllers. In essence, just cramming an entire GameCube console into the top of the system. And it works really well. I mean, the Wii wasn't too far off from the GameCube, technology-wise, but the backwards compatibility is still really good. Hell, before I got my own GameCube, the Wii was actually my preferred system for playing GameCube games, and I have so many fond memories of playing GameCube games on the Wii, having not grown up with a GameCube. With that said, back comp is never gonna be perfect, and this is no exception. Of course, games that require extra peripherals like the GameCube broadband adapter aren't gonna work here, alongside things like the Game Boy Player, which are both pretty obvious. But why do I have to use the Wiimote to select the GameCube disc channel when I'm not even gonna use it in-game? It doesn't even play the animation. Things start to get kinda fucky too when you realize that a lot of Wiis don't even have back comp to begin with. The Wii Family and Wii Mini are budget redesigns of the Wii that, as a result of cost cutting, both scrap the GameCube functionality. Like, come on, it just looks barren up there. It's easy to understand why they did this, I guess, since the GameCube was already well past its prime by the time these redesigns came out, but it's just still really sad to see this compatibility go. Backwards compatibility support slowly being phased out of a console's lifespan is not an uncommon occurrence though, since, over time, interest in the previous console is naturally going to wane. But other times it can just get really confusing. Case in point, the PS3. The PS3 is weird. At first it was a clunky, confusing, and expensive mess which only really arguably had games, and yet somehow managed to beat the Xbox 360. It's actually a good console from what I've heard, and has one feature that you don't really see in a lot of other consoles: multi-generational backwards compatibility. Kind of. You see, all PS3 models, even up to the Super Slim in 2012, have PS1 back comp thanks to software emulation. Interesting choice given the PS1 was already 12 years old by the time the PS3 came out, but I respect it nonetheless. When it comes to playing PS2 games, however, things get a little bit more dicey. Whereas all PS2 models support PS1 games, even up to the Slim models, the PS3 only has 4 models that support PS2 games, only 2 of which are hardware-based in that they both include PS2 chips, while the other 2 use partial software emulation. And then they just stopped? 10 more PS3 revisions were released after this, including the Slim and Super Slim models, none of which contain any PS2 backwards compatibility. I'm guessing this happened because of price cuts, but it has the unfortunate consequence of driving up the prices of the original 4 PS3 models because of demand. Now you could always take to the PS Store to download these games yourself, which is more akin to Virtual Console, but it's still a neat option to have if you want to play these games. But considering that only 60 of the 4,500 PS2 games released are available here, it's a hard option to choose. So if you do want to play PS2 and PS3 games together, your best bet is to just buy both consoles separately. It's not the best option to have, but considering how expensive these backwards compatible models are, you're better off not spending so much cash. And then there's the 360. You see, the original Xbox and 360 have wildly different architectures that would make having Xbox games playable on the 360 a challenge. But it's not like they didn't try. When the console first released, around 200 Xbox games were compatible with the 360, which ain't half bad for 2005. And over time, more and more Xbox games were added to this list, including games downloadable on the Xbox 360 store. And by the time support ended, just under half of the 988 original Xbox games were playable. Not great, but nowhere near as bad as the 60 out of 4,500 PS2 games downloadable on the PS Store. But how does it go about playing these old games? You see, both consoles are very different in architecture, so having hardware-based backwards compatibility was a no-go. Instead, the Xbox 360 relies on good old emulation, a technical feat for 2005. But because it was 2005 emulation, there are bound to be a lot of problems, and even a lot of games that do work on the 360 have some sort of issue with them. These usually boil down to performance issues ranging from minute to barely playable, but in a game like Thug 2, having noticeable frame drops is not ideal. Scrolling through the list of backwards compatible Xbox games is actually quite amusing, since you can find issues that you wouldn't expect to find anywhere else. Like, did you know that Super Monkey Ball Deluxe takes over 2 minutes to start? Or that trying to play some of the arcade games in Shenmue 2 crashes the game? Hell, some games had to be removed from the list because of how badly they ran. Nightfire, for example, is completely unbeatable because some of the driving sections just refuse to load. Despite these issues, however, when it runs well, it runs really well. Imagine my shock when I booted up Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, a game from 2002, and it runs perfectly fine in 720p. Even the games that don't run in HD still look really good for the system they're on. Overall, the 360 isn't that bad of an option when it comes to backwards compatibility. Just know that some of the games you might want to run on it aren't going to work well. So if you're really going to play Test Drive Off-Road Wide Open, you're out of luck. But we all know the PS4 doesn't have that problem, right? Fuck. Moving on to the 8th generation with a bad start, the PS4 infamously didn't have any backwards compatibility when it was released, a huge step down from the precedent that they had set with their earlier consoles. Even the PS3 was at least compatible with something. And needless to say, this was a disappointment. I'm guessing this was mainly for cost reasons, as well as the PS Store already being a thing since you could download older titles through it, but once again, 60 out of 4,500 PS2 games on here? That's sad. But you know what isn't sad? The Wii U. Bad example. Even though it might have sold at most 13 units, it did have something the PS4 couldn't do. It could play Wii games. So, take that, bitch. Like the Wii U's back comp is in essence just cramming an entire Wii into the Wii U's hardware, but it's far more nuanced than just that. I mean, the Wii was far more robust of a console than the GameCube ever was, and the Wii U, already designed to work with a lot of Wii hardware, works really well with this robustness. Not only does every Wii game work here, they all work insanely well. And for the longest time, the Wii U was my dedicated Wii device because of how smooth they feel and how good they look. And it's not just limited to the games either, since you could also download Wii software via the Wii Shop channel, transfer software over to the Wii U, and display games onto the gamepad, albeit not play on it directly. For a failed console, I'm pleasantly surprised at how much care they put into making sure everything works here. By far the best part of the Wii U's back comp, however, and this is more in line with Virtual Console, is the ability to download Wii games via the Wii U eShop. Now, only 35 games work on this service, but they all work just as well as they would on an actual Wii, and most of them were for around $20 too, which is a steal. This is a really good deal, a good chunk of really good and valuable Wii games for a cheap price. What's the catch? Oh. That's the thing about relying on storefronts for backwards compatibility. They're not permanent. And as more and more storefronts are getting shut down, as a consequence, it gets harder and harder to access these games. So while the Wii U is still a really good backwards compatible device, not having any of these games downloadable anymore is a huge sting, especially with how expensive some of them can be. Then you have the Xbox One. You see, the Xbox One and 360 have wildly different architectures that would make having 360 games playable on the One a challenge. But unlike the 360, which had something day one, the Xbox One didn't even have it at first. This, of course, changed sometime in 2015 when Xbox 360 support was finally added via emulation. Now, I don't own an Xbox 360 personally, but apparently it handles this emulation pretty impressively. I mean, at first it could barely even run Castle Crashers during testing, and by the time support ended, the backcomp support grew to encompass over 600 Xbox 360 games. Hell, a few games have some enhancements on select consoles, such as HDR and better resolution. And Xbox users were excited too, since about half of the Xbox One user base had used its backcomp at one point or another, which led Microsoft to add further support to the system, adding original Xbox support, making it another rare example of multi-generational backcomp in a game console. Of course, since the original Xbox is so old, only 6% of games work here, but that is 6% more than what I was expecting, so I'll give it that. And it doesn't end here either. Going into the 9th generation, we have the Xbox Series X, arguably the stupidest name for a console. But it's clear to see that Microsoft was ready to bring backwards compatibility to this thing from the start, touting it as a launch feature instead of just waiting a few years like they had done with the Xbox One. And because the Xbox Series X and One have the same list of backcomp titles, that means that, at least on the Xbox Series X, you can play 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th gen games all in one system, which is just really cool. And it's not necessarily alone in this either, as the PS5 can play most PS4 games on it as well. I guess they just didn't want to make the same mistakes they had made with the PS4. I mean, half the reason why I bought a PS5 was just so I could play PS4 games on it, because Lord knows I wasn't gonna get much mileage out of this thing without it. And finally, we return to Nintendo once more with the Switch. Damn it. This is a cartridge-based console. What did you expect? It's super unrealistic to assume that they'd have any chance of getting Wii or Wii U games physically playable on this thing. Of course, you have the option of NSO, where for a pretty penny, you can get a good chunk of a certain console's game library, but this is more in line with Virtual Console than anything. So it's not a surprise that Wii and Wii U games don't work here, but Nintendo wasn't quite ready to forego any of these titles. I mean, even though the Wii U was a massive failure, there were still a lot of really good games that released for the system. So what did Nintendo do to curb this backcomp problem? Deluxe Edition, port, sequel, Deluxe Edition, sequel. Most of the big hitting Wii U titles were carried over to the Switch in one way or another, which, of course, begs the question. Is this the new face of backwards compatibility? You kidding me? Now this is veering into rumor territory, but there are rumors going around that the next Nintendo console will have Switch backwards compatibility, even including some Xbox-like enhancements for certain games, which would be great for games like Tears of the Kingdom. Now only time will tell if these rumors turn out to be true, but since backwards compatibility is so commonplace in gaming nowadays, I wouldn't be surprised if they were. And since the Switch 2 is likely going to be cartridge-based like the Switch, I imagine it's going to be like a DS and 3DS thing where both consoles are going to have slightly different cartridge shapes. Alright, I should probably talk about that too. That's right, home consoles aren't the only thing that are backwards compatible, as handheld systems have historically supported this feature for a while now. Of course, you have the Game Boy systems, where most new versions like the Color or Advance are compatible with the versions that came before it. Most. And this tradition kept on strong with the Nintendo DS, which, although shedding the Game Boy and Game Boy Color backwards compatibility, still plays GBA games perfectly fine thanks to an extra cartridge slot. Plenty of games even use this slot as a sort of accessory port, such as Guitar Hero or Tony Hawk's Motion Sickness. So of course, with a lineup of handhelds so hell-bent on being backwards compatible, it was only natural for the next DS iteration to keep this compatibility. Damn it. That's right, the DSi is one of the few Nintendo handhelds that isn't backwards compatible, sacrificing the GBA slot for portability and cost reasons. And it's hard to blame them for getting rid of this backwards compatibility. I mean, by the time the DSi came around, the GBA was already 7 years old, and it's clear to see that creating an internet-ready handheld device with a focus on portability was a higher priority. Hell, you could even argue that DSiWare works just as well as a replacement for this removal. But at the same time, it wasn't just GBA support they were losing. Because keep in mind, plenty of games used that cartridge slot as an accessory port or to access new content, making it pretty much unusable on the DSi. It's a win-lose situation since DS games work really great on here, but the lack of GBA support can stink for some. Just go with whatever handheld you think works best. Then you have the 3DS, the last Nintendo handheld with backwards compatibility, being natively compatible with all DS software. Even the games that normally shouldn't work on the 3DS do, and that's because the 3DS uses a sort of DS mode for its compatibility. From what I can tell, it's similar to how the Wii U handles backwards compatibility, just cramming an entire DS system into the hardware of a 3DS. And like the Wii U, it works really well. I mean, you can even play DSiWare on the system, granted you downloaded them before the eShop shut down, or are willing to sail the 7 seas to get them. There are a few caveats to this back comp, however. Games that use the GBA slot of course don't work here, as is the case with the 3D feature, go figures. Also, the resolutions tend to be kind of fucky since the 3DS top screen has a different proportion compared to the DS one, so the screen has to be resized and enlarged to make do. You can make it more faithful to the original size by holding down start when the game loads, but with a screen size this small, it's hardly ideal. Overall, if you want the best quality for the games, I'd stick to a DSi XL since the screen looks a lot sharper. But the 3DS still stands as a great option for backwards compatibility. And that brings us to the PlayStation handhelds, the PSP, PS Vita, and PS Portal. The Vita can only download PSP and PS1 games, the Portal is just a handheld to stream PS5 games on, and the Portable is compatible with, I don't know, bread? Well, that's anticlimactic. But there remains hope. Where there's a will, there's a way, and where there's a console, there's Homebrew. It's an epidemic. You see, consoles like the PS Vita may have limited back comp, but thanks to Homebrew emulation, tons of consoles can be playable. The Xbox 360 too can only play a sliver of the original Xbox's game library, but thanks to homebrewing, we can finally see why a lot of them aren't supported here. Even the Wii as well. I mean, Nintendo was the way I played a lot of GameCube games growing up, such as SSX Tricky or the SpongeBob movie. You know, the essentials. Now, you could argue that this stuff isn't technically backwards compatibility and is more in line with homebrew emulation, and you'd be correct, but I still think it's notable enough to at least warrant talking about here. And there are consoles like the Wii U, for example, that have backwards compatibility that just can't be accessed without homebrew. The Wii U having pretty much a full GameCube backwards compatibility that can't be accessed without an exploit. It's easy to see why a lot of this is only accessible via homebrew. The Wii U doesn't have any memory card slots for the GameCube, for example, and the Xbox 360 can barely run games like Beyond Good and Evil. But it's clear to see that gamers do want backwards compatibility and are willing to go through dear god anything to be able to play Test Drive Off-Road wide open on the 360. And that's why backwards compatibility is so important. It's just really nice to have one console be able to play an already established game library from the get-go. But since a lot of consoles don't have it, at least in a full capacity, whenever it does show up, it shows that the company does care about having these games accessible to a wide audience. And with technology being more and more advanced nowadays, it's almost easier than ever to incorporate it, so much so that when it's not incorporated, fans take it into their own hands to include it. It truly shows the lengths people will go to make these games playable, even if the results are iffy or don't work that well. So it's important to recognize when a console does have backwards compatibility, since who knows if the next generation of consoles will have it in the future. The Xbox 360 can go to hell though. You're telling me I can't play Test Drive Off-Road wide open on this thing?